Before I begin my homily, I just want to say thank you to everyone for your prayers and your support. While my dad was sick, and as most of you know, he died January 4th, and is very, very, very much appreciated. So, last Saturday, I had just finished morning prayer, and I was starting to work on my homily for this weekend, when my youngest daughter, Catherine, texted me that she and my wife, Cindy, were going to go to the Museum of Natural History, and they wanted me to come along. To be honest, this kind of annoyed me. Why did she choose to go to the museum now? We've lived in Washington, D.C. area for almost 7 years, and I can't recall the last time that she wanted to go to a museum. And on top of that, I had mentioned to both of them the night before that I was behind in completing the draft of my homily, and I really needed to complete it by Saturday morning. But then I felt bad. I did not want to say no to the opportunity to spend time with her and Cindy. Suddenly, I felt really anxious. Her simple text and invitation to go to the museum had somehow uncorked a ton of anxiety and sent me spiraling down an emotional vortex, even though I realized all the while that I was probably way overthinking the whole thing. So I paused, I took a deep breath, and I said a prayer. And I asked God for peace, patience, and some understanding. And while I was praying, it dawned on me that the anxiety that I was feeling was coming from the fact that Catherine is moving to San Diego in 2 weeks. And Cindy and I will not have an opportunity like this to go to a museum with her again anytime soon. And although my other two daughters already live in California over 2,600 miles away, Catherine, up to now, has been attending college and working here on the East Coast, and she's been within a half a day's drive. So at least in my mind, I believe that I have been close enough that if she really needed me for something, anything, I could be there relatively quickly. But that will not be the case anymore after she moves to California. Last Saturday morning, I guess, all that started to sink in. Thinking about her moving to California really freaked me out. It'll be the most outward sign yet that although my normal life routines have been gradually changing over the past several years, I have not, despite what I've told myself, fully accepted the fact that maybe she does not, of course, need me as much as she did when she was younger. And that maybe I've tried to cling to old routines and maybe even tried subconsciously to prolong her independence on me and Cindy. So I decided to get over my annoyance, open my heart to this unanticipated interruption, and of course I went to the museum with her and Cindy. And we had a great time. If I had not been open to the interruption after all that anxiety, I would not have had the opportunity to spend such a wonderful time with Catherine before she moved to California. This is week 4 of our series, Life Interrupted. In the readings this month, we've been meeting individuals who have experienced life-altering moments, interruptions to the normal ways in which they live. Father Mike has suggested in past weeks that if we are open to recognize them, when these changes occur, God often offers us accompanying signs to help us to know that it is actually Him who is doing the interrupting. In week 1, God sent the Magi an actual physical sign, a star in the heavens, and told them to leave the comfort of where they were and follow the star to find God, Jesus lying in a manger. In week 2, the sign was a voice, God's voice, speaking to Samuel during the night. But Samuel did not recognize the sign, that it was God who was speaking to him, until he received the wise counsel of the elder Eli, who told Samuel that it was indeed God who was speaking to him, and that he should answer, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And in last week's gospel, God called Simon, Andrew, James, and John, all fishermen, to not only leave their comfort zones, their lives as fishermen, telling them that he would instead make them fishers of men, but then he made them instruments to bless the lives of so many other people, then and throughout history. This can itself be a sign from God, when the interruption in our lives leads us to bless the lives of others. But even when God offers us signs that it is Him interrupting our lives, We human beings do not really like change. So we do not always recognize or acknowledge these signs. We do not trust even God, even though we have seen the amazing things he has done in our lives and the lives of others. In today's responsorial psalm, sung so beautifully by the choir, from Psalm 95, the psalmist writes, "If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts." Later in that psalm, the psalmist writes, "Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, as in the day of Massah in the desert, where your fathers tempted me. They tested me, though they had seen my works." The psalmist was referring to a very specific event from the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, when God interrupted the lives of the Israelites by freeing them from slavery in Egypt. What's crazy is that you would think that all the Israelites would have welcomed that disruption, right? Moses rescuing them from enslavement. Well, some of the Israelites had actually started to accept their lives as slaves and were even more fearful of change. Sometimes we can become so comfortable with the status quo, whatever it is, that we prefer it even when it is painful and hard. At Meribah and Massah in the desert, the Israelites became thirsty and so began grumbling to Moses, asking for water to drink and questioning God, hardening their hearts towards him. They all knew that God had been there for them in the past and had even seen signs like those which Father Mike has referred to in his homilies. And they'd seen this evidence that he was the one watching over them. In fact, in the previous chapter in this very book of Exodus, right before that event, they were hungry and he provided them manna from heaven to eat. But they still hardened their hearts and they still did not trust God. So, God gave them yet another sign, telling Moses to strike the rock at Meribah and Massah with his staff, producing water for the Israelites to drink. Later, in the book of Exodus, we read that even in spite of their lack of faith and trust in God, God still led them into the promised land, a wonderful place flowing with milk and honey. In today's psalm, God reminds us that when he interrupts our lives, like he did the Israelites, we should trust him. We should believe that he will also lead us to a new and wonderful place as well. But we also do not trust God, and we do not open our eyes and hearts to recognize signs he provides to let us know that he is interrupting our lives, to lead us to something better, something more fulfilling, something more necessary for us at this particular moment in our lives. We can become especially closed off as we get older. We can get comfortable with circumstances we find ourselves in, even if not ideal, like the Israelites who came to accept their lives as slaves in Egypt. We too can harden our hearts and stop listening for and being attentive to God speaking to us, trying to interrupt our lives to make them more fulfilling. So, the psalmist called on the people of his time and calls on us today to not do this, to not harden our hearts, but to open them instead to hear God, recognize the signs he gives us, and trust him. The psalmist reminds us that God was present for the ancient Israelites, and if today we hear his voice and harden not our hearts, he will be present for us as well. So how do we know if we are open to hear his voice and to recognize these signs? How do I know if I have hardened my heart? Well, we can start by asking ourselves, do I pray and ask God for guidance when I make decisions? Am I truly listening then for his answer? Am I stuck in a routine where I don't want anything to ever change, regardless of how difficult things may be for me now? Can I and do I embrace spontaneity? Do I think there is only one way, my way, to see particular situations? If so, how can I be sure that it is also how God sees those situations? Is God trying to interrupt your life? Is he sending you signs that he is calling you to go in a different direction, leading you to something which will really force you out of your comfort zone? Maybe a family member desperately needs you at this moment, but you have been writing them off. Maybe a coworker or classmate is struggling, but instead of offering help, you've been avoiding them. Maybe you have been asked to volunteer here at church or in the community, but have not yet accepted that invitation. Maybe you have thought about joining a small group here at St. Pius, but for some reason have resisted the commitment. Well, maybe this Lent is your time to take the plunge. Sign-ups for Lenten groups will start next weekend. Maybe God is inviting you to accept an even smaller disruption in your life, like taking advantage of an opportunity to spend time with a loved one, maybe even at the Museum of Natural History. And maybe all you need to do is be open to the interruption and trust that God will inspire you to write a good homily later. Like, the jury's kind of out on that one. Are there signs from God that he wants to interrupt your life in a small or in a big way? And maybe you're not seeing or recognizing those signs because you have hardened your heart, closed yourself off from changes to your routine, and been clinging to the comfort of your established life's rhythms, not willing to admit that it may be God who is speaking to you, calling you to a change. This week, I challenge you to look for signs that God may be interrupting your life, that he may be calling you to leave your comfort zone, to trust him, to follow him to something new and something different, something amazing and something wonderful.